The wind cut across the mountains with a sharp, freezing bite, carrying with it only silence and the occasional call of distant birds. That morning, a ranger named Daniel spotted something unusual on the rocky slope ahead. At first, he thought it was just another patch of snow melting unevenly among the stones. But as he came closer, his chest tightened. Lying motionless on the cold ground was a snow leopard cub, its thin frame barely rising with shallow breaths. The animal's fur was dirty, tangled, and clung loosely to its frail body. Daniel crouched, his gloved hand hovering uncertainly above the cub. He could see ribs pressing against the skin, eyes dull and unfocused. For a moment, Daniel feared he was already too late. He pressed 2 fingers gently near the chest. There, a faint beat. The cub was alive, but only just. "Radio the center," Daniel called to his partner, Emma, who stood frozen a few steps back. "We found one. Critical condition." Emma's voice trembled as she relayed the coordinates. Her hands shook as she pulled a blanket from her pack. Daniel wrapped the cub carefully, mindful of its limp limbs. The blanket looked oversized against such a fragile body, but it was the only warmth they could give for now. The trek back down the mountain was painfully slow. Every few minutes Daniel stopped, checking for signs of breathing. The cub's chest rose so faintly it was hard to tell if life still clung to it. Once, he thought he had lost it, but then a weak exhale brushed against his hand. "Hold on, little one," Daniel muttered. "Just hold on." By the time they reached their vehicle, Emma's eyes were red from silent tears. The cub lay curled in Daniel's lap as the car jolted along the uneven road. The rangers knew the center was hours away, and every minute stretched like an eternity. They kept checking for movement, for any spark that said the animal hadn't given up. The cub's tail twitched once, barely noticeable, but it gave them hope. When they finally arrived at the rehabilitation center, the staff rushed to meet them. Dr. Miller, the lead veterinarian, didn't waste a second. "Get him inside," he ordered, as 2 assistants lifted the bundle from Daniel's arms onto a stretcher. The cub's head lolled to the side, eyes half closed, as they wheeled him into the clinic. The air inside was sharp with antiseptic. Machines hummed softly, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the tiled walls. Daniel and Emma followed to the doorway, but were stopped by a nurse. "You need to wait outside." Through the glass, they saw Dr. Miller working quickly, checking vitals, inserting in 4-line. "Severe dehydration," he muttered, not looking up. "Malnourished. Possible infection." His voice was steady, but the tight lines on his face betrayed the urgency. The cub's paw twitched faintly as fluid began to drip through the 4. Emma leaned against the wall, whispering, "He's so small. I've never seen one this weak." Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the cub. He replayed the sight of that lifeless body on the mountain, and how close it had been to being just another frozen shape among the rocks. He couldn't shake the thought that even with all this help, it might not be enough. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally, someone stepped out with updates. Temperature unstable, pulse erratic, minimal response. Each word dug deeper into the knot of fear in Daniel's chest. By evening, the cub was lying on a padded table under a heat lamp, still barely moving. His breathing rattled in his throat, fragile and uneven. Finally, Dr. Miller stepped into the hallway. His gloves were stained, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Daniel and Emma stood quickly, searching his face for an answer. "He's alive," the doctor said slowly. "But we don't know for how long." Emma swallowed hard. "Does he have a chance?" Dr. Miller looked down, his voice quiet but firm. "We don't know if he will make it through another day." The cub spent the first night under the heat lamp, his breath shallow and uneven. The clinic was quiet except for the soft beep of a monitor and the occasional rustle of gloves. Daniel stayed in the hallway until dawn, pacing, sitting, standing again, unable to rest. Emma tried to sleep in a chair but kept jerking awake, expecting to hear bad news at any moment. When Dr. Miller stepped out in the early morning, the lines on his face looked deeper. "He's still with us," he said. "But the next days will decide everything." Inside, the cub was connected to fluids, antibiotics dripping steadily through the 4. His body trembled from fever, eyes closed, lips dry. A nurse wiped his mouth with gauze, whispering softly as if words could soothe him. The animal did not respond. The first week was a blur of crisis. His temperature swung dangerously high, then dropped low enough to cause alarm. The staff took turns monitoring him around the clock. Emma helped where she could, holding small syringes of liquid nutrition, pressing the plunger gently so a trickle of sustenance reached his mouth. Most of it dribbled out, but sometimes, just sometimes, he swallowed. "Come on, little guy," Emma murmured. "You can do this." Daniel watched through the glass, fists clenched in his pockets. More than once he heard Miller's voice tight with frustration. "He's not responding. We're fighting uphill." Still, they refused to stop. Each time the cub's breathing faltered, someone adjusted tubes, raised oxygen, warmed blankets. Each time his pulse weakened, Miller ordered another test, another round of fluids. Sleep became a luxury the staff could not afford. By the end of the first week, a shift appeared. The cub opened his eyes for a few seconds. They were dull, clouded with exhaustion, but it was something. Daniel leaned forward, pressing his palm to the glass. "He's still in there," he whispered. Emma smiled weakly, tears gathering in her eyes. But survival was far from certain. On the 8th day, the cub's fever spiked, so high the monitors screamed. Dr. Miller barked orders, assistants rushing to bring ice packs, cool fluids. They worked for hours, the room tense, sweat dripping from their brows. When the fever finally broke, Miller sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "We almost lost him tonight." 2 days later, a new milestone. Emma held a small bowl of water beneath his chin. "Please," she whispered, tilting it slightly. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a faint effort, the cub's tongue touched the surface. One sip, another. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bring a quiet cheer from the room. Daniel closed his eyes, relief washing through him. That same evening, the cub tried to lift his head. The effort lasted only seconds before he collapsed back onto the blanket, chest heaving. But it was the first sign of strength returning. Late at night, Miller reviewed the blood test results. He stared at the paper, jaw tightening. Daniel and Emma stood nearby, waiting for a word. Finally, the doctor set the chart down. His voice was steady but grim. "The infection is worse than we thought. His organs are struggling. Even with these small steps forward, the numbers show critical failure. He might not make it." For weeks after the rescue, the cub no longer lay limp for days on end. His body still bore the marks of starvation, thin limbs, patches of dull fur, but his eyes had changed. They no longer looked like glass. They followed movement, blinking slowly, as if the spark of life was starting to catch again. Emma arrived each morning with a gentle greeting. She crouched near his enclosure, placing a bowl of water or small pieces of meat on the floor. "Morning, fighter," she said, her voice soft. At first he would only sniff and then turn away, exhausted. But one morning, Daniel caught his breath when the cub stretched his neck forward, licked the water, and kept drinking until the bowl was half empty. It was a moment so small, yet it felt like a miracle. By the 5th week, he made his first clumsy attempt to stand. Daniel and Emma were there, watching from the other side of the glass. The cub planted his front paws, pushed upward, trembling violently. His back legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the blanket with a weak thud. Emma gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. Daniel whispered, "Come on, try again." The cub lay still for a while, breathing hard, then made another attempt. Again he failed, but this time he stayed upright for 2 long seconds before sinking down. It was enough to make both rangers exchange a look of hope they hadn't dared to feel before. Dr. Miller remained cautious. "Small steps. Don't read too much into it," he warned, reviewing the charts. "His body is still fragile. The infection hasn't cleared entirely. But yes, he's stronger than he was." The doctor's eyes, though, betrayed a flicker of guarded optimism. The bond between the cub and his caretakers deepened quickly. Emma often sat on the floor outside the enclosure, sketching him in her notebook as he rested. Daniel brought in old ropes and pieces of wood, hoping to encourage movement. At first the cub ignored them. Then one afternoon, he dragged a rope a few inches with his paw and held it there. Emma laughed softly. That's the start of play. The staff gave him more space, moving him from the clinic table to a small indoor enclosure with padded corners. It wasn't the wild mountains, but it was room enough for him to stretch. Day after day, he tried to rise. Each attempt left him trembling, but each attempt lasted longer. Until, one morning in the 6th week, he stood on all fours. The moment lasted only moments before he sank back down, but Emma had tears streaming down her face. "He did it," she whispered. Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. Soon, they opened a door to a slightly larger pen that connected to his indoor space. The cub stepped out cautiously, his legs stiff, paws slipping on the concrete. He staggered forward, then stopped, sides heaving with the effort. Every staff member nearby froze, watching in silence. The cub looked around, nostrils flaring at new smells, then collapsed gently onto the floor. But he had walked. Even if it was only a few steps, he had walked. Over the next days, the cub grew bolder. He tried short movements from one corner of the pen to the other. His paws slapped unevenly against the ground, his tail dragging. Daniel encouraged him from the other side of the fence, speaking low and steady. "That's it. One more step." Emma knelt close, her eyes wide with encouragement. Slowly, shakily, he managed to cross the enclosure on his own. The change in mood was undeniable. Where the first 2 weeks had been filled with despair, now there was cautious belief. Staff members who once avoided talking about his chances began referring to him as our fighter. Even Dr. Miller allowed himself a brief smile one afternoon when the cub managed to lap up his food without any help. But just when hope began to feel steady, the cub's body betrayed him again. On the 29th day, his breathing slowed. Daniel noticed it first. Something's wrong. They rushed inside, and the monitors confirmed it. His body temperature had plummeted without warning. His frame shook with cold, eyes half closed, unresponsive to touch. Panic rippled through the staff. Blankets, warming pads now. Miller barked. Emma held the cub's paw in her hands, whispering frantically, "Stay with us. Please stay." The hope they had carefully built now teetered on the edge of collapse. The crisis of the sudden temperature drop left everyone shaken, but against the odds, the cub pulled through. Over the following weeks, his body slowly regained strength. By the start of the 3rd month, he no longer resembled the lifeless bundle Daniel and Emma had carried down from the mountains. He was still small, still fragile, but now he carried himself with intent. The veterinarians adjusted his diet carefully. Liquid nutrition gave way to soft meat, minced finely, so his weak jaws could manage. Emma crouched near the enclosure as he sniffed at the bowl, then tore into the food with hesitant bites. "That's it," she said softly. "Chew and swallow." The cub ate clumsily, but each meal stayed down. Over time, his appetite grew, and so did his energy. The small indoor enclosure could no longer contain his curiosity. Staff members moved him to a larger pen with open ground, scattered logs, and low platforms. Daniel leaned on the railing, watching the cub limp forward at first, his paws splaying awkwardly on the dirt. Every step looked like a battle, but he kept moving, testing the space. By the end of the day, he had circled the entire pen, stumbling but refusing to stop. Dr. Miller introduced basic rehabilitation exercises. He set obstacles for the cub to climb over: small branches, uneven surfaces, low rocks. The cub resisted at first, swiping irritably at the unfamiliar objects. But when hunger and instinct pushed him to reach food placed on top, he tried. His body wobbled, muscles quivered, but each attempt strengthened him a little more. Emma noted every change in her journal. Week 9, he's climbing the low log without falling. Week 10, he chased a rope for the first time. Daniel, meanwhile, brought in thicker branches, encouraging the cub to sink his claws into wood. The sound of scratching filled the pen, a sound that sent chills through Emma's spine. It was the first reminder of what he was meant to be in the wild. By the middle of the 3rd month, his movements were steadier. He could pace from one side of the pen to the other without collapsing. His coat grew fuller, patches of dull fur replaced by healthy shine. He stretched often, his back arching, paws extended, tail flicking as if rediscovering what his body could do. Emma laughed one morning when she found him perched clumsily on a log, staring down as though he had conquered a mountain. The cub began to test the limits of the pen. He climbed onto platforms, then tried small leaps. At first he landed heavily, staggering on impact, but day after day he improved. Staff members cheered quietly whenever he cleared the gap. "He's learning balance," Daniel said, awe in his voice. "He's remembering what his body is built for." Meals became more demanding. The staff introduced tougher cuts of meat, hanging pieces higher so he would stretch and pull. The cub growled softly when frustrated, pawing at the food until he succeeded. Each growl, though faint, felt like a sign of his awakening nature. Emma recorded it on her phone, whispering, "First growl, month 3. The bond with his caretakers deepened further, but so did their awareness of the line between help and dependence. Daniel often reminded Emma, "He's not a pet. We're preparing him for something bigger. He has to learn to fight for himself." Emma nodded, but her eyes softened each time the cub brushed against the fence where she sat. One evening near the end of the 3rd month, the cub climbed onto the highest platform in the pen. The sun was setting, painting the sky in deep orange. He stood tall, his silhouette sharp against the light. Then, as if testing his own voice, he opened his mouth and let out a raw, throaty sound. It wasn't the faint squeak of a weak animal. It was a true, guttural roar, followed by a flash of claws scraping against the wood beneath him. The sound froze everyone nearby. Emma's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she whispered, "That's the first time." Daniel nodded slowly, a rare smile breaking through. He's not just surviving anymore. He's ready to live. By the 5th month, the cub no longer looked like the frail creature Daniel and Emma had first carried in from the mountains. His body had filled out, muscles visible beneath a healthy coat of thick, spotted fur. His eyes, once dull and half-closed, now burned with intensity. Each morning, he leapt from platform to platform in the enclosure, testing his agility, landing with the sure-footed grace of a predator rediscovering himself. Emma often found herself staring in disbelief. "He doesn't even look like the same animal," she murmured one afternoon as the cub sprinted across the pen and launched himself onto a high log, gripping it with powerful claws. Daniel nodded beside her, his expression serious but proud. 5 months ago, he could barely breathe. Look at him now. The cub had grown restless in the pen. He paced constantly, muscles twitching, tail lashing whenever he heard noises from beyond the fence. His instincts were returning, pushing him to explore, to hunt, to claim space that no walls could provide. He shredded branches with sharp claws, tore at meat with clean bites, and practiced crouching low before springing forward, as though preparing for the wild. Dr. Miller observed carefully, clipboard in hand. Physically, he's reached a stable point. He's strong, coordinated, alert. The question is whether he can survive outside. Emma frowned. "Do you think he's ready?" Miller hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "He's young. Releasing him would mean risking his life in an environment that might not forgive mistakes. But keeping him here, it's not the life of a snow leopard. We have to weigh both sides." The debate stretched late into the evenings. Some staff argued for continued care within the center. Others believed his natural instincts were strong enough to give him a chance in the wild. Daniel, watching the cub leap and roar, felt torn. "He deserves freedom," he said quietly to Emma. "But freedom comes with danger. If he fails, it's final." Emma leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the cub as he prowled the length of the pen. "Whatever happens, at least we gave him this chance. We pulled him back when no one thought he'd last a day." In those final weeks of the 5th month, the cub's energy was boundless. He climbed with confidence, balanced on narrow beams, and leapt higher than ever before. His roars grew deeper, echoing across the grounds, no longer the frail cries of a patient but the fierce call of a survivor. Staff members often stopped their work just to watch him, awe in their eyes. He had become a symbol of resilience, proof that life could push through even the darkest hours. On the last evening before his progress was to be formally evaluated, Daniel and Emma visited the enclosure together. The sky was painted in deep purples and golds, the air sharp with mountain chill. The cub paced near the fence, then climbed onto the highest platform, standing tall against the horizon. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. His eyes glowed with a strength no one had dared to dream of months earlier. Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "He's not a victim anymore." Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on the cub, his own voice low but certain. "He's a snow leopard. A fighter. Alive." The cub threw his head back and roared again, claws slicing the wood beneath him. The sound rolled across the pen like thunder, deep and commanding. For a moment, the entire center seemed to pause, listening to the declaration of survival. Dr. Miller, standing behind them, closed his notebook and spoke quietly. Now his story isn't about almost dying. It's about living.